Yes. Uh, Jasmine, please introduce yourself and please tell us a story.
Yes. Hi, I'm Jasmine Carvalho and lived in many countries, from India and Saudi Arabia and now in Canada. But the most important thing is I am a Toastmaster and I think I'm stepping into storytelling. But as a Toastmaster, we had to do a storytelling manual and we had to tell an emotional story. We could make up a story or just tell a story. And I chose the former, to make up a story. So now the story I'm going to tell is totally made up. Nothing is real. I have a very nice life, but the story that I'm going to tell is something that had touched me. And so here we go. The story's name is Tick, Tick, Tick. Tick, tick, tick. I was seated between my mother and Sister Jinsey. And I knew that this is the last 15 minutes of my father's life. I knew he was being prepared to be executed. I could almost see him. And then it all came flooding back. Yes. When I was little, my father would come back home from work and he would call out, Malika, Malika. And I would run to him and he would carry me and throw me up in the air. Oh, I would giggle and laugh because I loved my father and my father loved me. I knew I was the apple of his eye. Yes, when I was growing up, I grew up in a small little town called Anandpur. And there my father worked as a driver for the owner of Shanti Industries, the only industry in that little town. He was proud of what he did, and he would keep the owner, Mr. Chandran's cars always gleaming. Mr. Chandran was also very fond of my father. And we had a lovely family. I was the only child to my parents. And I grew up. I was 15 when one day my father drove a beautiful, lovely blue foreign car. And he said that it was Mr. Chandan's latest acquisition. I was so excited to see that car. I wanted to touch it, but my father admonished. He never allowed us to touch those cars. It was new. 2 days later, I was walking home from school and suddenly I heard a honk. I looked back and there was this blue car. And I looked at it and it wasn't my father driving the car. It was instead Mr. Chandran's son. Now, Mr. Chandran's son stopped the car and invited me over to get into the car. I hesitated and said no, but he insisted and the temptation was too much. I wanted a ride in that foreign blue car. So I got in. He took me for a ride. And then he said he had to go to this house and then he would drop me home. So I agreed and we went. But the house that he went to was that spooky house that my parents had told me never to go close to. It was on the edge of town, just next to this forest. And when we went there, he said, why don't you come in? And I said, no. He said, no, come along. I was curious. I wanted to know what's inside. I went. When I went in, there was kind of smoke. I saw two people around. And then Mr. Chandan's son went in and he brought me a glass. And he said, why don't you drink this? I said, no. He forced me at this point. He said, come on, drink. And I said, no. He came on me. He pulled my clothes. He pushed me to the ground. And then my innocence was compromised. Yes, I was raped. He beat me. I soon passed out. I didn't know what was happening. The next thing, all I know was I was left. I was thrown, I guess, in that forest. Because when I woke up, all I saw and felt was the stony, sandy forest floor, perhaps some leaves. I tried to get up, but I was so sore. I was hurting. I couldn't pull myself up. I groaned. It was already dark. And then slowly, I don't know how long later, I heard my father. I heard my father's voice. Malika, Malika, are you here? And then with all my effort and strength, I called her, Appa, Appa. He heard me and came to me with a flashlight shining on my face. He saw my plight. He just grabbed me and took me to a hospital. He made arrangements for my mother to come. And slowly they heard my story of what happened to me. Well, after some time, I kept seeing my father's face change. His eyes from compassion moved into rage. Some rage I had never seen in his eyes. All I know later was that my father went to Mr. Chandran's house. He sought out Mr. Chandran's son and stabbed him to death. And with blood in his hands, he went to the police station and surrendered himself. Yes, Mr. Chandran was grieved. This was his only son. He was angry. He could not believe that his fondest employee, his driver, would do this. He had no mercy. And yes, my father was in jail. And Mr. Chandran sought the death penalty. Meanwhile, my mother was at my side, but she had to hear hurtful words, scorned by the town, people accusing her. And when I was ready to be discharged, I guess I physically became all right, but mentally, I was traumatized. I was tortured. And my mother decided that she will move to Chennai and live in oblivion. She took me, we went in a train and went to Chennai. One of her cousins lived in Chennai, and he fortunately accepted us into his little home, and we stayed there. But I just did things in a stupor. I stared and stared. I didn't do anything. I couldn't get over. I didn't know what was happening around me. And then maybe many months passed by. I have no clue of what time was. There was this lady in a brown sari who came and sat next to me. She just sat next to me for maybe 15 minutes, and then she left. Again, she came the next day and she sat for 15 minutes next to me. She did not say anything. Earlier, I had heard people encouraging me. Some were nice to me. Many scolded me. Some even slapped me, trying to get me out of my stupor. But this lady just sat next to me. She came every single day, and she perhaps must have sat for 15 minutes. I have no clue. And she did this again, I don't know how long, but maybe a month. And then one day, as she got up, I pulled her down. I pulled her down and held her and cried. I cried. Earlier, I had never cried, but this time I cried and I cried. I could have filled the whole room with my tears. But she just held me and said again, nothing. And when I kind of stopped sobbing, she asked me, would you like to come with me? And I said, yes. She asked my mother's permission. My mother obviously knew who she was, and I went with her. Yes, she was Sister Jinsi. Sister Jinsi from a convent. She took me to the convent, and slowly I started talking. I told her about how guilty I felt. How guilty I felt. Why did I succumb to that temptation? Why did I get into this car? Nothing of this would have happened if I didn't get into that car. Or why did I go into that room? House? I don't know. And then, slowly from that guilt, I started talking about my father. If my father really loved me, yes, he did this because he loved me. He didn't want anyone to touch me or hurt me. But then, think of it. I am now, he has become a murderer, a convict, and I, a daughter of a murderer, a convict. This was too much for me, and I couldn't get over. Sister Jinsi was kind enough to listen to everything. Now, she was a counselor, a trained counselor, so she listened beautifully. And slowly, she got me out through her listening and talking. She even told me some stories. I slowly started responding to her, getting over. She encouraged me to go to private school or distance learning. So I did, and I kept going to her convent often. She became my best friend. And later, she slowly got me out. She wanted me to get over. She wanted me to forgive my father because she knew that my father was pining to see me. It took me 3 years to really go and see my father. But I did. When I heard that he was going to be executed, it was his wish that he sees us, his family, and so I went. I went there and I held him. He held me and we both cried. Yes, it was difficult. We cried and we cried. I knew. And then, and now, I can hear tick, tick, tick. I can hear the executioner call out, it's time. It's over. My father is no more. Thank you.
Anybody thoughts?
Well, Jasmine, you lived in that story, and we followed you in.
Thank you.
I forgot. After a while, I felt reassured when I remembered that you said you created that story, or you were
Yes.
living it.
Yes, Karen. I mean, this whole story was inspired, I should say, when I read John Grisham's book, The Chamber. And it has always gone into me. I wonder what happens to the family of someone who's convicted. It must be so hard for that family, and sometimes wrongly convicted, sometimes like this, where circumstances has made that person a convict. Whatever it is, we just don't know. But I always wondered what goes on in the life of the family members of convicts. And that's why this whole thing came into me. And I made up the story 10 years ago, but I brought it to life again.
Mm.
Yes. And it's hard to heal from something like that. It's really hard.
Mm-hmm. It's good to have silence afterward, just to ponder.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I must say that I did not copy anyone's story. It's just the only thing was from the chamber where there also the person is going to be convicted. So that's the only part that I borrowed. The rest of it is my own kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. One story begets another.
Yes.
And Jasmine, you're bringing attention to this very harsh reality, right? So many young women are marginalized and, go through this all over the world. It's a universal truth. So with your story, you have, made us aware of this and reminded us that this is a problem all over. Thank you.
Yes. I always wanted to say the story, and I was thinking of should I say a upbeat story or something like this, but this was a story I made up and I wanted to say it, so that's what I chose.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.